Okay, today we're going to talk about environmental moral reasoning, but first I wanted to introduce you to this Cecropia moth, which was kind enough to hatch outside the fence of my backyard a few years back. And a couple of things I want to point out about this one. This is a moth that you can find in Nebraska. They like to eat the leaves of lilac bushes is one of their favorite foods, and so that's a place you might want to look for the caterpillars or for the cocoons. But notice the antenna. What do you think those very feathery antennae are good for? Now we all know that antennae are sense organs, but think about why on earth would this moth need to have that much surface area? Because that's what these feathery antennae give an insect, as opposed to, just your regular sort of TV antenna looking antenna, I guess you'd call it. And so these incredible sense organs are very important for finding a mate, because this moth hatched out, and within an hour I went back out and there was another moth right next to it. You may or may not know this, but moths don't have digestive systems. When they go through metamorphosis, they lose their digestive system. So they have a very short time to find a mate. And so they need to find a mate as quickly as possible. And it turns out that a Cecropia moth can find a mate 3 miles away. So you need these amazing sense organs to be able to sense the pheromones to find a mate. And so this is just a really great example of structure and function and adaptation that I wanted to share with you. So, after enjoying the beauty of the moth, on to our lecture, which is on children's development of conservation knowledge, values, and practices. And what I'm going to describe to you is a series of studies done by Peter Kahn, who's from the University of Washington. Okay, some questions to think about. How similar or different are environmental knowledge, values, reasoning, and behavior of children and adolescents in different cultures? Because this is one of the goals that Peter Kahn had of doing research on children in various places across the world. And are there consistent developmental patterns in knowledge, values, reasoning, and behavior? In other words, do children progress through a particular pattern regardless of where they live? So first, we'll talk a little bit about some studies that Peter Kahn conducted in Houston with children and with parents that have to do with human concerns and moral reasoning. First, to give you a little bit of background on moral domain theory, how do you know if something, an issue, is in the moral domain? Because there are a lot of things that you could consider to be right or wrong, which is usually one of the first things people think of when they think about morality. But why is something right or wrong? Because you can think that it might be wrong to forget to send a thank you note to someone, but is that a moral issue? It might be wrong to cut in line, but is that a moral issue? And so to think about what exactly makes an issue a moral issue, we have to think about what the impact is on others. And so typically we think about impact on others in terms of other humans. When you engage in an action that has moral consequences, that's something that can potentially threaten the welfare, justice, or rights of another person if it is something that might be harmful. And these fall under the umbrella of what some people call negative morality. In other words, thou shalt not, murder, kill, steal, and so forth, versus positive morality, which are things that can benefit the welfare of others. So you can think of moral issues as being either positive things or negative things, but ultimately they impact the welfare or well-being of others. So another way to think about this is in terms of domains. Some things fall in the moral domain, and these are things that are generalizable. They're not contingent on rules or laws or conventions, and they appeal to justice and human welfare. Now, just to give you the contrasting case to make that more clear, there are some things that are in the personal domain. So that's really about an individual's interests, and it's not a matter of moral or conventional purview. Now, a way to make that clearer, oftentimes conflicts between adolescents and their parents are about the boundaries between the personal and the moral domain. So for example, an adolescent might say, well, it's my own personal choice to smoke a cigarette, or, fill in the blank, whatever that is. And the adult, the parent, may think, well, that's not really your own personal individual choice, because it might harm you, it might harm others, and so the parent is looking at the fact that this particular action may have harm and consequences. Um, Driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs used to be considered something that was more under the personal domain, possibly under the conventional domain. It was really culturally not until the mid-1980s when it began to be viewed as much more in the moral domain. So the argument when it was in the personal domain was, how can you hold someone accountable when they are impaired? And the answer to that is that you have to make that decision before you're impaired. But it was not viewed as a moral issue. That has changed tremendously, legally and in terms of culturally. Another example of that is in terms of the laws banning smoking in restaurants and other businesses. So smoking was viewed as a personal right, a personal choice, but because of the strong evidence of the negative impact of secondhand smoke, it really falls into a moral domain, and now there are laws governing it. Because of the potential harm to workers in the restaurants or establishments, and also to the other patrons of those establishments. But the thing about a moral issue is that it is a moral issue regardless of whether there is a law pertaining to it, or a rule, or a cultural norm. And so again, to make the contrast, you can probably think of laws that are unjust in the past or in the present. There are some laws that violate rights. And so, as this is a continual iterative process of creating a more just society, some things that are standardized or guided by laws are moral issues, and some are not as well. Now, another domain would be the conventional domain. These are things that we do that just generally maintain order. They're things that we engage in that are social norms, that they're not necessarily just under the personal domain, but they're also not moral issues either. Sometimes looking at the gray areas and thinking of a particular case is helpful to illustrate this. So for example, let's go back to the adolescent and the parent again. Clearly what most people would agree is under the personal domain might be matters of taste in dress and music. But a parent might have some say about some of the boundaries around that. And there are going to be other conventions. So schools have dress codes. The school's dress code might be considered to be under the conventional domain. An adolescent might make certain choices about what parts of their body to pierce, and the parent might decide that that is something under the personal domain, and they might agree on that. But the parent might also make a decision that some parts of the body being pierced might be under the moral domain. Or you could even think of conventions about tattoos. There are laws that govern or that guide when an adolescent can get a tattoo with or without parents' permission. Same thing with body piercing. So a lot of those things might be considered under the personal domain, but when your behavior begins to affect other people, and in particular when your behavior might affect the welfare and rights of others, that's when it begins to fall into the moral domain. Okay, so what about moral reasoning? There are a couple of different ways to think about this. I mentioned a few moments ago the idea of negative morality, and that is things that you're obliged to not do. So for example, prohibitions tend to be judged much more seriously than things that you are supposed to do. So failure to do something that you're supposed to do is generally not viewed as negatively. So obligatory morality is something that you are obliged to do or not do. In other words, there's not really a choice. On the other hand, discretionary morality is something that it's a good thing to do, but it's not something that you have to do. So think of discretionary morality as things like volunteering or giving to charitable causes. Those would be examples of discretionary morality. Helping a neighbor in need. That's a moral action, it's a moral behavior, but it's a choice. Obligatory morality, on the other hand, is not a choice. And so one of the things that Peter Kahn and others have wondered is, do children attribute moral status to nature or to the environment? So to find out, he interviewed children in Houston in first, third, and sixth grades and asked them these questions. Do you ever think about the environment? And it's important to start with these kinds of open-ended questions because no one had ever really done this before. Do you think plants and animals are important? Do you know about any problems that might hurt the environment? And in case you don't know, Houston is a terribly polluted city. There are a lot of refineries in Houston. Do you do anything to protect or take care of the environment? And then asked a series of questions about whether it would be okay to throw trash in the bayou, which is a familiar waterway, to the children, and whether they thought that would cause harm to birds, to water, to the view, to people, other living things, and if they cared whether that kind of harm happened. And it's important to ask these kinds of questions because you can't really establish whether children think that harm is a matter of moral domain unless they understand that harm actually occurs. So the vast majority of kids do think about nature and the environment, and you can see that when you ask kids what they think about, that animals and plants are the most frequently cited things that they think about. They did talk about pollution and garbage, so with relative frequency they think about some negative things. And it's also important to point out that some of the kids mentioned drugs and human violence, and Peter Kahn believed that was important because it's part of their environment. And when we talk about environment, we're talking about the human and the natural environment, because remember, humans are part of nature. I've done this research with preschoolers in a variety of different areas, and in one of the inner city locations we also had children talk about drugs and human violence. So some people fight, some people are bad, when we asked them if they knew of any problems in their environment. So that was an example of the kind of response that they would give. So, and it is a problem, that's a legitimate response. Asking them if animals and plants are important, again, the vast majority of kids said yes. And Peter Kahn asked these kids if they ever talk about the environment with their family, and 3/4 of them almost said yes. And that when they talk about the environment, you can see almost half of them would talk about litter or garbage. And interestingly, more than half of what they talk to their families about in this instance, if you look at it, are negative things. So litter, air pollution, water pollution, and drugs, those are all negative things that they talk with about their families. Now, when we asked this question of preschoolers, they almost universally said no. And so after we interviewed the first 24 kids, we stopped asking the question. So apparently in elementary school, kids talk about the environment with their families much more frequently. When kids were asked if they do anything to help or protect the environment, recycling and picking up litter were common responses. And you can see that 3/4 of the kids recycled. In a few minutes, when we look at what the parents reported, you'll see that these proportions are really similar to what the parents reported, and that gives us confidence in these findings. Okay, now Peter Kahn asked them the question, what if the entire community threw trash in the bayou? This is an important question because the implication is, what if everybody did it? Meaning, what if that was normal? Would then it be okay? And the vast majority, again, said that would not be all right, even if everybody did it. Then he asked them, what if there was a city very far away that was very similar to our city, and it had a waterway similar to our bayou, but there was a law that said it was okay to throw trash in the bayou? Would it be okay then or not okay? And you can see here that nearly all of the kids also said again that it would be wrong for individuals to do it, and it would be wrong for the group to do it. So they're pretty universally talking about throwing trash, littering a waterway as being a matter of obligatory morality. They understood harm as well. They understood that trash would harm birds, water, insects, the view and that there's potential for it to harm people along the river. They would say things like, who would want to swim or be by that stinky river? Then he asked them, does it matter to you? In other words, do you care if the harm occurs? So in the one case, this question is, would it be harmful? We need to know whether they understand that there's harm. And then second, do they care if there's harm? And again, the majority of kids cared whether the birds or the water, the insects, the view, and the people were harmed. So what Peter Kahn concluded from this series of interviews is that almost 90% of kids viewed polluting the bayou as a violation of a moral obligation. In the previous slides, those were the percentages of the whole total group of kids. But here you can see that there was an increasing percentage if you look at first, third, and fifth graders. And so there was an increase in the extent to which kids really viewed it as a moral obligation. Probably in part because they're gaining greater knowledge, but also in part because their sense of welfare and rights and their understanding of cause and effect relationships is also developing as well. Okay, when he would ask them why they cared that that one of these entities would be harmed. So why would you care if the birds were harmed or the water or the fish or the people? 74% of the kids provided an anthropocentric or human-centered reason. In other words, they didn't want it to be harmed because then people couldn't enjoy whatever it is. They couldn't go swimming. They couldn't visit the waterway. They were focusing on how it would harm people. A little more than 1 in 5 kids talked about unelaborated harm to nature. In other words, they would just be talking about the fact that it's bad for the water, but not really explain why it's bad for the water, would hurt the water. And then 4% of the kids had a biocentric reason. In other words, something that is intrinsically valued about nature. And some kids even referred specifically to nature having rights. So fish have a right to live just like we do, for example. And one of the things that Peter Kahn found is that from 1st to 5th grade, you see an increase in the incidence of biocentric reasoning. In other words, kids understanding or reasoning that nature has rights, that, for example, fish and insects might want to live just like we want to live, or that they have a right to clean water just like we have a right to clean water. Now, looking at the parents' perspective, it's very similar to the children's perspectives in that they thought that animals and plants were important, open spaces, but a new theme emerged from the interviews with parents, and that is the importance of living in harmony with nature. And the way that themes emerge in research is that you ask open-ended questions, and then when you look at the responses, you look for things that are fairly common across people's responses. And so parents, what they meant by living in harmony had to do with experiencing nature, being in the right state of mind with nature, being in balance with nature, and respecting nature. But they also talked about challenges to having direct contact with nature because it was a very urban environment. Parents were asked why nature is important, and you can see that it's personal interest in what it looks like, the beauty of nature, were these 24% and 16%. That the welfare of nature, the well-being of nature, came up for almost 40%, and the biocentric reasoning was about 10% of parents. In other words, nature having rights in and of itself, independent of how humans can benefit from nature. So parents were also asked about what kinds of environmental problems they were concerned about, and air pollution and water pollution were significant concerns for parents. Garbage, and most believed they were directly affected by pollution in their neighborhoods. Now this answer is different than the children. Children believed that pollution was a problem, but they were less likely to believe that they were directly affected in their neighborhoods. They also thought that conservation was really important. This is the question of whether we believe that technology is going to solve our environmental problems, or if people changing their behavior is going to have a big role to play. And parents in this study anyway, 2/3 really thought that human behavior was going to have a bigger role to play than technology. Now, here's where if we compare the parents' responses to the children's responses, and is there anything you do to help the environment or nature, that the frequencies of recycling and picking up litter are fairly similar. Parents are really in favor of environmental education and drug education. This is 8.5 and 8.7 on a scale of 1 to 10. And they also were in favor of environmental education that would coordinate school curriculum with things that they could do at home. And national studies have also found that parents are very supportive of environmental education. They were also asked if they have conversations with their children. Remember, kids were asked if they talked about any environmental issues with their family. And there's a lot of similarity here. Chemicals and food parents talked about, whereas children didn't mention it. But there's a lot of similarity in the kinds of things that are discussed with children. Okay, so a second study that Peter Kahn did with children in Houston was the Prince William Sound study. And this was in response to the Exxon Valdez running aground in Prince William Sound. And he refined the methods a bit. Okay, so first he extended the age range. So 2nd, 5th, and 8th grade, going a little bit older than previously. And then also introduced the distinction of sentient and non-sentient nature. In other words, elements of nature that have feelings, that have thoughts and feelings and senses, like birds and insects and mammals, versus non-sentient nature like rocks. At least in our cultural traditions, rocks don't have thoughts, feelings, and awareness. So interviewing, the kids were interviewed in Houston, so they didn't experience the oil spill directly, but Houston is a state that has an economy steeped in oil, so kids are very aware. And also the Valdez crash was widely covered in the news. So think of it, the equivalent in more contemporary times would be the Deepwater Horizon. You know that was something everybody was aware of. So these kids knew about what had happened in Alaska. So you can see that the vast majority of kids believed that the oil spill caused harm, and that caused harm to both sentient and non-sentient nature. So shoreline was non-sentient nature, and you have to believe that there are pictures all over the news of oil-covered birds and oil-covered shoreline and people trying to rescue and wash them and that sort of thing. But they also understood or believed that the oil spill harmed the oil company. So this is a new dimension as well, realizing that there are cause and effect associations, not just for the physical environment and the living environment, but also for other entities, and understanding that would go towards the employees or to the ability of the oil company to make money. In terms of their reasoning about the spill, kids thought that it was not all right, even if there was a law that said it was okay to spill oil on the shore, or they thought that it was not all right to harm the shore. It was not all right to harm marine life. So the fish and the birds, it was not all right, even if it was a far off place where people thought it was okay, and they viewed the act of polluting the shoreline and of marine life as a violation of moral obligation. So for children who provided negative evaluations for all three questions, so remember, what puts something in the moral domain is something that transcends rules, and it's generalizable across contexts, and it's prescriptive. In other words, thou shalt not, or thou shalt all the time. So kids who were clear across all three of those provided moral justifications for at least one of the three. So this is just a measure of consistency and internal consistency for them. Now the 2nd graders didn't generalize as often as the 5th and 8th graders, so you can see that probably their understanding and their beliefs and their reasoning consolidated over the course of development. So for example, the younger kids might have had a negative evaluation for one question or two questions, or they might have had the negative evaluations but not provided the moral justifications, whereas it looked as though those things are becoming consolidated over time or over development. Now, of the three ways that kids could provide justifications, generalized harm to nature, anthropocentric or human-centered reasoning, why something is not okay because it harms people, or biocentric reasoning, something that has to do with nature having intrinsic value. You can see that biocentric reasoning is pretty infrequent for the second graders. And even though it goes to 26% and 20%, given that there were only 20 kids in each age group, that could have been a difference of one child there. So essentially you see an increase over time in both biocentric reasoning and anthropocentric reasoning. So it appears as though kids are beginning to have a more differentiated sense, understanding of what is harm, and are more specifically becoming concerned about how it harms people and what the value of nature is. If looking at the difference between sentient and non-sentient nature, again, just think of this as things that have feelings and things that don't have feelings, so far as we know, that there's a really low incidence of biocentric reasoning for shoreline, for rocks, and for water. Kids often don't understand that water itself is a living system, and they just sort of think of it as a medium in which there are fish and there are birds and so forth. But they're much more likely to provide biocentric justification for living things like birds. And so Peter Kahn concluded that the sentient aspects of nature pull more towards biocentric reasoning than non-sentient aspects of nature, which makes sense. Okay, some of the new things. When you do repeated studies, you want each one to expand or to offer a new aspect of knowledge. And so the first study in Houston compared to the second study in Houston of the Prince William Sound oil spill expanded the age range, expanded the issue of sentient and non-sentient nature, but also expanded the understanding of children's reasoning to the harm to economic prosperity. So that was where their responses to would it harm the oil company, or their spontaneous responses describing how that would happen, and also harm to ecological systems beyond the specific place where the tragedy occurred. And so it's some evidence that children of these ages are beginning to recognize interconnectedness beyond the immediate. An additional question in this study compared children's judgments of death that results from human activity versus predation. And of course humans are predators as well, but that's not really how the question was asked. And 90% of children differentiated between the two. So if animals die due to human activity that's not predation, so animals dying because of an oil spill, for example, or animals dying because of a forest fire started by humans, they judge that as being in the moral domain and wrong, whereas they understood that that predation, death due to predation, would be not considered in the moral domain. They seem to understand that sometimes one organism needs to die in order for another organism to live. And that's not the situation when there's an oil spill. Ducks and fish don't need to die so that humans can live in that instance. Or if you start a forest fire, the animals in the forest don't need to die so that humans can live. But when one animal hunts another animal, they understand and they don't judge as a moral issue the fact that one animal might need to die for another animal to live. So after taking these two studies together, Peter Kahn proposed a model in which children progress from their understanding of an unelaborated harm to nature. In other words, you shouldn't litter because it's bad for nature, or it's bad for plants and animals, to beginning to differentiate between the human-centered and nature-centered reasoning. And then finally, when they begin to enter late adolescence and early adulthood that they begin to coordinate human and nature-oriented considerations. In other words, they begin to see, if they're following this progression, they begin to see that humans are part of a community of life, and so the biocentric concerns and anthropocentric concerns can be considered one and the same. So some ways to think about this: isomorphic would be a direct equivalency between humans and nature. And I mentioned a few examples before. Iso means same. So iso, like in isosceles triangle, you have a triangle where the sides are all the same length. Fish have a right to live just like we do. Fish are the same as we are in that respect. Hypothetical is putting oneself in the animal's position. I wouldn't want to live in dirty water if I was the fish. And so these are a couple of the ways that children begin to understand the rights of animals. Another way to think about this is to look at things from the perspective of the animal. And so you may need to think like a cat, or you might need to think like a wild animal. And some of this came up with some of the questions about predation. And so, for example, in our house several years ago, we had some problems with the food chain. We had a ferret that was killed by a dog. We had a sugar glider that was killed by a cat. We had a sugar glider that was killed by a ferret. We had a ferret that was killed by a snake. It was just like Wild Kingdom. Basically, we had a little bit of difficulty keeping some of the animals contained that were supposed to be contained. So you probably know that ferrets can get out of pretty much anything. They can also get into pretty much anything. And containing the sugar glider was challenging also. But in any case, what the issue was is that the child in question who would own the animal had to understand that it is the nature of a husky to hunt, and it is a husky is a predator. And so as angry as my son was and upset and sad that his pet had been killed, he had to put himself hypothetically in the animal's position and to understand that. And so some humans find this really hard to do. So for example, you shouldn't jump into the gorilla enclosure at the zoo. You hear about these kinds of things happening. You should not be stupid in a national park where there are bears or other wildlife, because not only might you get hurt, but your actions might cause another animal to be killed. And so you have to be able to, when you're coordinating human and natural welfare considerations, one of the things that kids begin to be able to do as they develop a greater understanding of animals is to look at things from the animal's perspective and understand why it is that animals may need their own space, or to understand animals' behavior as what they need to do to survive. And that would include predation. Okay, one of the questions raised by Peter Kahn's research is the interconnections between welfare or caring and justice. And many of you may be familiar with Lawrence Kohlberg's developmental model of moral reasoning, and that was focused really on justice. And in the 1980s, early 1980s, Carol Gilligan, a researcher whose name was Carol Gilligan, really tried to separate these two concepts. And so she suggested that perhaps women were more oriented towards caring and men were more oriented towards justice. And what research has found over the course of a couple of decades is that really caring and welfare are so tightly interconnected that you really can't differentiate them, and there aren't any gender differences. In other words, if your decision is based on the welfare of others, you care about others, and so you can't separate those two things. So justice involves balancing or coordinating two or more claims for welfare. So for example, one of the vignettes that has been used in research is the child is going to school, has some money for either lunch or for a school event, but on the way they see a family that is hungry and living on the streets. Should they share the money, or should they keep it for themselves and take it to school? And so how they coordinate that, or how they balance that, is the action of justice. So how does this play play out between humans and nature? Well, Kahn proposes that it's a dialectical relationship, that as children are developing moral relationships with people, that translates into having a moral relationship with nature and vice versa. So as kids are learning to relate with nature in ways that are respectful of the intrinsic value of nature and respectful of nature's rights, giving animals their space, not torturing animals, for example, not taking a magnifying glass and frying the crickets, although plenty of people who did that as kids grow up to be normal adults, but that experiences that are respectful and caring of nature can also carry out over and back to having moral relationships with people. Okay, so a lot of people ask the question then, does this matter if you're living in very close contact with nature? Is it different? And so Peter Kahn carried out a couple of studies in Brazil where kids have very high contact with nature on an everyday basis. And in fact, when we've done research of this sort here in Nebraska and surrounding states, people ask, does it matter if kids live in the country or not? And as much as we've been able to measure so far, we have not found a significant difference in children's reasoning or their affinity for nature. But in any case, Peter Kahn took the approach of going to a Brazilian city located within the Amazon rainforest and a village on the Rio Negro River. And it was important in part because it allowed him to compare children with daily intimate contact with nature with more urban children. And so the village is fairly remote. Their main livelihood is fishing and logging. And so first, remember, as with the other studies, you needed to establish that kids understood environmental problems, understood what caused harm. And they were aware of burning of the jungle. There was logging and there was burning of the jungle. They were aware that there was air pollution, harm to animals, and that there was litter. And most discussed the environment with their families. Interestingly, again, like before, it looks like 2/3 of what they discuss with their families were problems in plants and forests and animals, being either neutral or positive, was about 40% of what they talked about. But there really wasn't a whole lot of difference between the two locations on the positive aspects, but about twice as many discussing air pollution in the city as in the country, and nobody discussing water pollution or garbage or litter in the city, but that it was discussed in the country. So a little bit of a difference there. Okay, when kids are asked do they do anything to help the environment, interestingly, planting and caring for trees came up more frequently for kids in the city. And it may be that in the city you have to be much more deliberate about taking care of your urban environment, whereas if you're living in a remote village, those things are growing around you, but you're not necessarily caring for them. And remember that this was also a logging community. Caring for animals, more frequent in the village. And influencing others to be environmentally responsible was more frequently cited in the village as well. So he asked the same 10 questions that assess pro-environmental views, values, and behaviors, and found really the 7.03 and 7.5 on a scale from 1 to 10 is not different from each other. So the children in these two environments were more similar than different. And kids understood that humans need the forest. They could name things that the forest provided. They understood that the forest was being cut, and they also believed that it was wrong, even though their families relied on the forest for their livelihood. So this is where you need to coordinate your beliefs and judgments. Okay, so understanding that the forest is being cut, but also understanding that your family relies on it for its livelihood. What should be done? Well, a vast majority of kids said the government should prohibit the cutting of the forest. Also, the vast majority of kids thought that they should take action, and they also thought that there was a way to use it without completely destroying it. Almost 2/3 of the kids in both places thought that the rainforest would exist forever, and there really wasn't any difference in their orientations towards conservation in in the village or in the city. Okay, so the challenge here, how children coordinated the conflict between the well-being of the forest and economic livelihood really varied. Sometimes they acknowledged the conflict, but said it was okay to log even though there's harm. So they weren't really able to bring those things together. Their coordination fell on the side of just legitimating the logging. Other times they advocated for the government limiting logging even though people may depend on it. So it varied, but the kids were aware of the conflict between the claims for welfare through economic livelihood and also the claims for welfare through the well-being of the forest. They understood that. Okay, their justifications and their judgments, the majority in both sites thought it was wrong to throw garbage in the river, even if everybody did it, even if it was the norm, and even if it was in a different region, as with the other studies. And the majority of the justifications were anthropocentric and harm for nature, with a minority being biocentric. So this is very similar to the previous studies. We're seeing a pattern now emerging across the different cultures and the different biomes. Houston in the United States and Brazil in the rainforest. Okay, Brazilian children used more anthropocentric welfare justifications than children in Houston, and this is kind of interesting because a person might think that if you're living in the rainforest that you might actually have more biocentric justifications. But it's possible that kids in the Amazon, both in the rural and urban locations, better understand that they depend directly on nature for their physical survival than urban kids in the United States. So they may have a greater awareness of that. Children in the Amazon rated plants as more important than kids in Houston did, and Brazilian children were less likely to be concerned about the death of insects, which may cause, they are very aware of the fact that they can cause death in people. They can also cause death in people in the United States, but not as frequently or as obvious. And so the likelihood of knowing someone who's been affected by, for example, Lyme disease or West Nile virus is much lower, whereas kids in the Amazon are much more likely to have known somebody who's harmed by insect carrying diseases. But there weren't any other statistically significant differences, and the structure and nature of children's reasoning was often almost identical across the sites. Okay, so just to review, justice involves balancing or coordinating two or more claims for welfare, and those two claims can come from two people, a group of people and an individual, two groups of people, or it can be on the part of nature. Does nature have rights? When welfare is at stake, the issue or the question is in the moral domain. That's how you know if something is a moral issue. And an issue is one of obligatory morality if it's not contingent on rules, social conventions, or location. In other words, that's something that is right or wrong no matter where you are. Now, oftentimes there are contexts to take into consideration. So for example, if you ask, is it okay to hit someone? You all can probably think of an instance when it is okay to hit someone, for example, in self-defense or to defend someone else. For protection. So that's a matter of coordinating the two different moral issues. So on the one hand, causing harm to another, and on the other hand, protecting oneself. And so when you're talking about moral issues, it's not just a matter of a particular action being right or wrong, but of coordinating different competing claims for justice, or looking at multiple rights that potentially come into conflict, and you have to make a judgment about that. So, if something is in the moral domain, if it's not contingent on rules, conventions, or location, keeping in mind that sometimes there are rules that are not respectful of rights or welfare. There are rules that aren't fair, is what I mean, or that violate people's rights. And that just because something is a social convention doesn't mean that it's not also in the moral domain. So think about how these issues relate to judgments of morality as we talk about current issues related to sustainability and the environment.